Hi, this is Pastor Josh from First Baptist DeQueen. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night study, a verse-by-verse walkthrough of the entire Old Testament. Tonight we are starting in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 21. And Abner said to David, I will arise and go and will gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So Abner makes another promise here to David after having met with the tribal leaders and having brought Michal back to him. Abner now promises to go out throughout the rest of the land of Israel and work to rally all of the people to support David. Abner had used his influence and the power of his persuasion to convince all of the elders of the tribes under Ishbosheth to turn to David. He promises to go to all of the people under all of the elders of whom he had met and work to convince the people as well. Maybe Abner did not fully trust such a responsibility to the elders with whom he had met, or maybe he simply wanted to double check whether or not the elders were able to convince all of the tribes to turn to David. For whatever reason, Abner feels as though such a commitment and promise from the people needs his personal touch to be confirmed. So he tells David that he is going to dedicate however much time is necessary to go out to all of the people and get them to make a covenant with David, confirming him as the one true king. And David has received back his first wife from Abner, and he has received statements of loyalty from all of the remaining tribes of all of the remaining tribal elders delivered by Abner. So now Abner promises to also deliver the loyalty of the nation. And David is incredibly pleased with Abner's overwhelming show of loyalty. So they separate on very peaceful terms, as you would in an alliance. Verse 22. So then the servants of David arrived with Joab from a raid, bringing much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David at Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the army that was with him came, it was told Joab, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he has let him go, and he has gone in peace. So Abner had left David's camp at Hebron on peaceful terms, or at least he thought. David seemed to be pleased with his alliance with Abner, even though Abner had led the army opposing him and hunting him at times. Abner had returned his wife Michal to him and had turned his back on Saul's son Ishbosheth. Now this seemed to have been enough for David to trust that Abner had in fact gone to the other tribal elders and turned them away from Ishbosheth. However, Joab had not been present or even in the camp when Abner had initially come to David. He had been out on what was apparently a very successful raid, considering the amount of spoil that he had returned with. Now, we're not told who Joab and his men had been out raiding, but I tend to think that we can safely assume that it was not any of the Israelite tribe. It may have actually been more of the nations that they had raided when they were still living in Ziklag among the Philistines. So when Joab returns to Hebron, probably in very high spirits considering the success of his raid, someone approaches him with some very unexpected news. You see, Joab hated Abner and had tried to pay him back for killing his brother Asahel after the Battle of Gibeon in 2 Samuel 2. And undoubtedly Joab never would have thought David would make an alliance with Abner simply because he had been Saul's army commander. But in addition, he had defied the will of God and had Saul's son Ishbosheth anointed as king instead of initially rallying support for David. And beyond all that, Abner had killed Joab's brother, who was also David's own nephew, his sister's son. Even still, David has met with Abner, allied himself with Abner, and then sent him away in peace without any repercussions. Joab is beside himself. He cannot believe that his uncle David, the great king, would do such a thing. And one thing about Joab, he is not at all afraid or intimidated by anyone. So after hearing about Abner's meeting, Joab marches right up to David and tells him exactly what is on his mind. Look at verse 24. Then Joab went to the king and said, What have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why is it that you have sent him away so that he is gone? You know that Abner, the son of Ner, came to deceive you and to know you're going out and you're coming in and to know all that you are doing." Joab here appears to be angry and to be in genuine disbelief over what David has done in trusting Abner. It seems that if Joab had been in David's position, he would have struck down Abner the very second that he stepped foot into the camp. And knowing how Joab goes on to live, there would probably not have been any decorum about ordering someone else to strike him down the way David had done previously. Joab would have jumped at the chance to handle Abner himself. And so Joab's question at the end of verse 24 seems to imply that he thinks that David should have at the very least detained Abner instead of letting him go completely. And then notice that even in his disbelief and overwhelming hatred of Abner, Joab is still able to keep his head and speak strategically in the moment. From what is about to transpire, it's easy to assume that Joab's primary concern about Abner has nothing to do with deception, but rather personal revenge. And yet Joab does proceed to chastise the king for seeming to have placed any amount of trust in a man who has been their enemy for over a decade. Joab thinks that Abner only wanted to meet with David so that he could do a little recon on David's forces. Maybe this is exactly what Joab would have done were the situation reversed, but whatever the reasoning behind these words of warning, Joab is trying to appeal to the king's reason that an enemy cannot be trusted no matter how honorable they might seem to be. Maybe Joab is grasping at straws because he feels as though Abner has slipped through his fingers yet again. If only he had not been on the raid or had simply returned just a little bit sooner, then he would have been there before Abner had left. And then he could have taken care of the Abner problem himself without having to have this conversation with great King David. And if David gave Joab any kind of response to his confrontation here, it's not recorded. Joab's confrontation of David is presented as an outburst that concludes with Joab leaving without giving David the opportunity to say anything in return. So Joab leaves David with an anger-infused revenge plot developing in his mind. Verse 26. When Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah. But David did not know about it. Now, you can only imagine the kind of rage that was fueling Joab in that moment. He left wherever David was. It could have been a makeshift palace. It could have simply been David's house during the years in Hebron, or it could have been a building constructed or designated as where David would conduct his business. But Joab leaves. And he orders some of his men to chase down Abner with a secret ploy. Joab sends messengers after Abner, possibly telling him that David has something else to request of him. This well that he's at here, this cistern, was probably somewhere between 1 to 3 miles away from the town. I doubt that Abner would have considered to return if the messenger had been presented as being from Joab, or maybe Abner felt totally safe because the king had sent him away in peace. So he could have assumed that no one would dare to defy the king's treaty with him. So maybe he did not hesitate to return, even if the messenger had presented as being from Joab. He might have thought that he and Joab were on good terms despite having killed his brother. This kind of seems to have been the case, considering Abner's actions in the following verse in relation to Joab. In addition, the author here wants to make absolutely sure that we, as the readers, understand that David had nothing at all to do with the evil actions of others. And similar to the instance of Saul's death, we are definitely told that David did not condone, nor did he know of what Joab was about to do. And the actions of others, whoever they might be, can have devastating impact on our lives, even if we have nothing to do with however evil the actions that they do might be. Verse 27. And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the midst of the gate to speak with him privately. And there he struck him in the stomach, so that he died, for the blood of Asahel his brother. Now Abner was going to go on a cross-country campaign to convince everybody to come to David. And then Beyond that, we're not quite sure what his plans were. Maybe he planned to go home, retrieve some of his things, retrieve his family, and come back to Hebron. Maybe Abner was going to be a military consultant or a personal advisor to David. Or some of the commentators even thought that Abner could have been considered to be a replacement for Joab simply because he had had so much more military leadership experience. But the text does not give us any indication that David even considered for a second the possibility of replacing Joab. So Abner returns from wherever he had gone after what could be seen by everyone as a very successful meeting with David. And now Joab is in the camp at Hebron this time that Abner arrives. Maybe Joab just so happened to be at the camp by coincidence. Probably not. Joab probably intentionally did not lead any other raids outside of Hebron that day. Didn't want to leave that quickly because he wanted to make sure that he was in town when Abner returned. And so Joab does not allow Abner really to enter into the city. You notice that here. Either Joab was waiting for him right outside the gates, or he was standing underneath the gates. And the gates of these ancient cities were elaborate construction pieces. They were not just a simple gate or a simple door. It was probably a door, a little section, another door, a little section. It was probably very intricate. And many times in various ancient cities, it was also customary for elders to convene underneath or inside the gates of that town. And Absalom actually did this very thing some years later when he is trying to turn the hearts of the nation against David and towards himself. So Joab, his presence at the city gates may not have seemed out of place, as there were probably other men assembled there. And despite his age, Joab's position in the army and his relation to David could justify an appointment to the elders personally, or he could have been at the town gates in his role as commander, or even to speak to one of the elders. For whatever reason he gave to be at the gates, no one seemed to be suspicious that Joab was there. Even Abner suspected nothing as he approached the town and saw Joab waiting for him. Though the last time he had seen Joab, Abner had been chased by him with the intention of being killed by him. Though, again, maybe Abner assumed that since David had made peace with him, that Joab, being David's commander, that he would adopt the position of his king. Maybe this had been Abner's view on the role of a commander, one who surrendered personal feelings in favor of those of his king. Because Abner does not seem even in the slightest bit anxious as Joab convinces him to step into a seemingly private part of the gates. Abner did not have his guard up at all, as he did when he was being chased by Asahel. In addition, Hebron was supposed to be a city of refuge, in which a person who had accidentally killed someone else could be safe from vengeance from the family of the man who had been killed. Now remember that Asahel's death had seemed to have been accidental, as Abner had struck with the butt end of the spear instead of the point. And that may have been the very reason that Joab struck before Abner had entered fully through the gates. In Joab's mind, this could have been perfectly legal because the killer had not yet crossed the threshold of the city of refuge, so he was still fair game. And then once he had approached, maybe Abner thought Joab was going to give him a private message from the king. But Joab had something completely different that he was going to give Abner. And he proceeded to pull out some sort of weapon and drive it into Abner's stomach, killing him. Notice that Joab seemed to have intentionally struck Abner in the stomach to kill him, which was the same part of the body into which Abner had driven the butt end of his spear into Asahel. Apparently Joab had been spending much time planning and plotting this very moment as what he considered to be justice for his brother. And even though he may have thought that justice needed to be dispensed, it was not his responsibility to dispense that justice. We should never assume to usurp the Lord's authority and responsibility in our lives or in the lives of other people. Look at verse 28. Afterward, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are forever guiltless before the Lord for the blood of Abner the son of Ner. May it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner, because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. Now, once the news of Abner's death at Joab's hand had reached David, he is distraught. But notice that David did not sentence Joab to death as he did with the man who claimed to have killed Saul. Rather, David offers a curse upon Joab and his family, of which we can assume it means immediate family or descendants, because David is part of Joab's family. He is his uncle. Maybe David knew that Joab did not technically violate the law, but had intentionally and deceptively sought vengeance instead of justice. So David does not have Joab executed at this point, though later in 1 Kings chapter 2, in his dying instructions to Solomon, he will say that since Solomon is so wise, he will not let Joab's gray head go down to Sheol, the grave, in peace. David remembers what Joab does here in this passage for the next 30 plus years to give his son justification for having Joab punished. And so David, in this moment, here in 2 Samuel 3, he publicly proclaims his own innocence and issues a prayer of cursing on Joab. And what David wishes upon Joab is seemingly much worse than a quick and simple death to him alone. You see, because David calls for one of 5 things to always be plaguing someone in Joab's family for all eternity. David calls first for someone in Joab's family to either have some kind of discharge or leprosy itself. Both of these would have been uncomfortable, would have been painful, and they would prevent that person from participating in the temple worship. This exclusion from the temple worship would be a shameful dishonor among the people, seen as judgment from God. Then David says, or someone from Joab's family could rather, David says that someone from Joab's family could be holding a spindle, meaning that they would be too unfit for any kind of work outside of sedentary work in the home. A person who was unable to serve in the military was this kind of person. They had to work at home. They couldn't go out and work in the military. They couldn't go out and work in the fields. They couldn't go out and work in the market. They couldn't go out and work for someone else in town or someone else nearby. This kind of person they were incapacitated for some reason to the point of having to stay in at all time. Then the last 2 of the possible curses that he hoped for were either death or starvation. And David was furious at Joab's action, so much so that his hope is not simply against Joab himself, but against someone in each generation of Joab's family forever. Now keep in mind that just because David said these things, it does not mean that these things happened. God is under no obligation to do whatever we tell him to do, especially when we are wishing ill will towards someone else, even if the ill will seems to be justified. This curse is simply something that David hopes will happen, or maybe he even says that he says it in order to emphasize the fact that he had nothing to do with Abner's death. And then the narrator informs us, the readers, of something very interesting. We're told that Abishai is considered to have been involved in Abner's death, even if he was not the one who physically killed him. So Abishai did play some kind of role in the conspiracy to avenge his brother's death. But notice there in verse 30, we are reminded that Asahel's death occurred in battle and not randomly on a, nice summer's day. Death in battle was not considered to be murder. So even though Hebron was a city of refuge, Abner should not have needed its protection because the killing that he had participated in had been part of a battle. However, for Joab, since Abner had been the enemy in battle that day, his actions could not be so easily absolved. And though David forgave easily and offered mercy freely, Joab was not one to be so restrained. Look at verse 31. And then David said to Joab and all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn before Abner." And King David followed the bier. They buried Abner at Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. Then David held a state funeral here for Abner. This could have been because of Abner's position, but it could also have been to emphasize that he, David, had nothing to do with his death. David is going above and beyond to honor Abner, even though he had at one time been his enemy trying to kill him. David commands Joab and all the people who were with him to give all of the outward signs of mourning for Abner. Joab had been the one to actually kill Abner, but Abishai was also implicated as playing a role in his death. And now here, David indicates that there were quite a few other people who had allied themselves with Joab in the death of Abner. Maybe these people were simply those who sympathized with Joab's need to avenge his brother's death, or maybe these were people who actually helped to bring Abner back to town and who helped to keep people away from the town gate that day and who helped to suppress the news about the killing. Whoever they were, David considered them to be associated with Joab in the guilt that he bore for Abner's death. So David requires them all to go out and publicly honor Abner by mourning for him, for whom they had desired death. This is similar to Haman being required to honor Mordecai by the king in the book of Esther. Notice also the use of David's title here at the end of the verse. Not at the beginning of the section of the previous verse there where it says David and then it says King David. The narrator wants to emphasize David's royal position as he is taking part in the funeral procession of Abner, walking in the place of the family who would normally have been immediately following the bier, or close friends would have been in that position as well. So David proceeds to openly weep for Abner at his grave before all of the people who were present. And some of David's deep grief may have genuinely been for Abner and the kind of man for which he was known, but some of the grief could also have been for the disruption to the promise of great national unity and peace. There had been much hope when Abner had brought the rebelling tribes in unison to support the Lord's will for David's reign, and this hope was then threatened to be destroyed when David's nephew, David's military leader Joab, killed the man who orchestrated the peace deal. However, the death of Abner and then David's response could also be considered a confirmation of David as king in the minds of all the people. Whereas Abner's death could have been the undoing of the alliance, David treating Abner with such great honor proved to all the other tribes that David was indeed kingly. And then the text seems to hint at this as it refers to David as king 5 times in 7 verses here. Now, thank you for joining us as we walk verse by verse through the Old Testament. I hope you'll come back next week as we continue to see what is going on here and see David's lament for Abner and then see what ends up happening to Ishbosheth.